Well, welcome everybody to Downtown Harbor Church. If it is your first time here, my name is John, a lead pastor. Appreciate you guys coming on out. I do want to thank you for having grace last week and watching me on that screen. No one should have to be forced to look at my face that big for so long, but you got to do what you got to do. I mean, it was absolutely a nightmare. Friday morning was supposed to get out. They just kept canceling my flight Friday, Saturday. Then they put me to Tuesday, canceled that. When we finally got on Wednesday, we're like halfway down, and they go, we got to make an emergency landing in Washington, D.C. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And then we got a cold because of it. And so my wife and kid are at home. Hi, Charlotte. How are you? But here we are. We're in week 2 of our series that we're calling Daniel, where we are looking at the various times in Daniel's life, this Old Testament figure, various times where he took a stand for God. And our goal over the course of the next few weeks is to find out what it looks like for us to take a stand for the right things at the right time and in the right way. And so today what I want to do is I want to take a look at what it looks like for us to stand up for what is right. Stand up for what is right. And the way that I want to frame this particular discussion, because it's a kind of big one, is I want to take a look at what it looks like for us to have tough conversations with the people in our lives, friends, family, siblings, parents, all that kind of stuff. Because there's gonna come a time when someone you love or someone you care about is just making unwise decisions. They're kind of going down the wrong path, and God may prompt you to help guide that person back onto the right path, essentially to confront them, to speak truth into their lives. Now, when it comes to confrontation, when it comes to having difficult, sort of tough conversations, I would argue that people generally fall somewhere along what I'll call a confrontation spectrum. On the far end, you've got those who are unwilling to confront, right? Then on the other end, you've got people who live to confront, but they confront unlovingly. The truth is, you don't really want to live in either of these two extremes. We want to learn how to sort of strike a godly balance in these discussions, and that's what we're going to do today. So let's talk about just these two groups to begin with. Let's talk about those who are unwilling to confront. Generally speaking, and I love to generalize, right? People in this group will often say things like, well, it's really none of my business. If they want to do it, listen, it's their life, their journey, just you do you. And then like clockwork, they'll generally wrap up by saying something like, well, who am I to judge, right? Who am I to judge? This is a phrase, this is a mindset, this is an attitude that we encounter all the time, right? Maybe you found yourself saying this too, but who am I to judge? We got to explore this, okay? If we're going to understand what I believe God has for us today. Because the idea of judging somebody else is a tricky concept within Christianity. I mean, it really is. Because on the one hand, Jesus himself famously says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. You know who loves to quote this verse? People who don't like Christians. People who are not familiar with the Bible, people who are not fully aware of Jesus' teachings, they love this verse because it appears as though Jesus is really commanding what I'll just call a universal acceptance of everything, right? Any type of behavior, attitude, lifestyle, like whatever. And if you read this verse out of context, it sure seems that way. However, if you actually study the teachings of Jesus, if you just read the rest of that chapter for that matter, you'll find that Jesus is actually calling us to an incredibly high standard of living. So when Jesus says do not judge, he's not saying, you do you, right? Live and live, all that kind of thing. No. Jesus here is not prohibiting us from judging the lives of others. Rather, Jesus is prohibiting judgment in the spirit of how it's often done. And that's important. See, we break his command to not judge when we only think about the worst in other people. We break this command to not judge when we only speak about others' faults, when we judge an entire life based on its worst moments. We break this command to not judge when we presume to know the hidden motives of other people. And we break this command to not judge when we judge others without considering ourselves in the same circumstances. And so as Christians, and many of us here are Christians, while we are not commanded to judge in this manner, according to Jesus, we are in fact commanded to judge. But we're given strict guidelines when it comes to it. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? You should commit this to memory if you're a Christian. This is huge, okay? If someone is not a Christian, that means they have not signed up for Jesus' system of morality. And therefore, we as Christians cannot expect a non-Christian to act like a Christian, especially when Christians barely act like Christians. So Paul's like, look, if they're not a Christian, we are not to judge them accordingly. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's where I want to cautiously take it for the rest of the day. Paul says, but it certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. In other words, this is not a suggestion. You have a responsibility, Paul would say, to recognize, to be aware of when a fellow believer is living in sin or heading down the wrong path or making unwise choices. And we got a responsibility to help them, to confront them, to have a tough conversation if need be in order to get them back on the right track. So for those of us in this room who are unwilling to confront, just not kind of our personality, we might find Paul's command here to be a little intimidating, right? Now, what about those of you who are watching online or here today who are on the other end of the spectrum, and perhaps maybe you are somebody who confronts unlovingly? These people, and I say this with all due respect, are unhinged, okay? You're like a bull in a china shop, you know what I'm talking about? You got no boundaries. So like you don't know what's appropriate. There's no sense of timing. There's no finesse. There's no grace. There's no filter. And you firmly believe with all your heart that everyone is entitled to your opinion. Now, I'm not going to lie. I sometimes fall into this category, okay? I have been known to dole out unsolicited advice, but I do it in love because I know what's best, right? So we got folks all over the confrontation spectrum. I know this. So what we want to do today is we want to try to answer the question, okay, how do we confront in the right way, at the right time, and for the right reasons? Because God may call you to intervene in someone's life. Maybe it's your child. Got a teenage child, adult child, they're just, it's just, they're making unwise choices. You got to figure out when is the right time and in the right way to speak into their life without pushing them away. Or a friend, colleague, whatever. And they're just not themselves. They're just off. You can't put your finger on it, but they're just, they're distant. They're kind of not doing great at work. Maybe they're not really involved in church like they used to. You got to figure out a way how to speak into their life in the right way, for the right reasons, with the right motivation. That's what today is all about. So last week, if you were here, we met King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar is basically our bad guy during this series, at least during the first half. Now, 30 years have passed since last week's message. Now, during this time, King Nebuchadnezzar has spent a lot of time with Daniel. He has actually seen God work and move, and it's gotten his attention. So much so that there have been times where he's actually sort of leaned in towards God and even praised him. But then he kind of, his pride kicks in, and he pulls back. Maybe that's your spiritual journey as well. There's maybe a point in your life where, you're getting ready to commit your life to the Lord. Then you're just like, you know what? Never mind. That's Nebuchadnezzar. But one day, God gives Nebuchadnezzar this wild dream, and quite frankly, it freaks him out. And Nebuchadnezzar describes this in verse 10. Here's what he says. I saw a large tree in the middle of the earth. The tree grew very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, and it was loaded with fruit for all to eat. He goes on to say that all the wild animals are living in its shade, the birds nested in this tree, and the whole world was fed from this tree. Then he says that this holy messenger from heaven, that's his words, shows up in this dream and shouts, cut down the tree, lop off its branches, leave only the stump. And he says all of this to happen so the world may know that the Most High is the one who's in charge. So he gets this dream, right? And he wants to know what it means. So Nebuchadnezzar calls in what I'll describe as the dream team to see if they can interpret what he's just experienced. It says in verse 7, now, when the magicians and the enchanters and the astrologers and the diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. So then he calls in Daniel. And if you were here last week, you'll remember that God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret dreams. So Daniel now enters the scene. He's no longer 13, 14 years old. He's now like 40. And over the last 30 years, he and Nebuchadnezzar have built a pretty close relationship. He's interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar before. So he's built trust with this man. There's a rapport between the two of them. And when Daniel hears this dream, his eyes go big. He is terrified. And Nebuchadnezzar can see this. He says, Belteshazzar, that's Babylonian for Daniel, don't let this dream or its meaning alarm you. And I feel like Daniel's like, yeah, that's easy for you to say, coming from the guy who threw my buddies into a fire. But here's the deal. Daniel could have just chickened out, like I think the other guys did. He could have just go, you know what, Nebi, this is a tough one. I gotta be honest with you, I don't think it means anything. Did you have bad pizza last night? I'm just stumped on this one. I don't think this, he didn't do that. He lovingly takes a stand for what is right. And he speaks boldly to the king in order to help point him in the right direction. So Daniel says this, verse 19, my Lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. That's not a great start, right? That's like when you go to the doctor and he looks at your chart and he goes, right? You want to hear that. So Daniel is showing us here, though, that he really cares for this king. They have become friends, amazingly enough, and he did not want this dream to be true. And so he begins to interpret this dream. He says, Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Then it starts to go off the rails. He says, however, you will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. In other words, you're going to be driven out into the wilderness, and you're going to go insane. He goes, 7 periods of time will pass while you live like this, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But, Daniel says, there's good news. The good news is that the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. All right. Daniel has now interpreted this dream. His duty is done. He could have stopped there, but he didn't. He then has the courage to speak truth into the king's life. Not because he thought he was better than the king, not because he was arrogant or prideful or because he had any kind of ulterior motives. He spoke truth because he loved the king. And he wanted this king to change his ways so the king could experience the goodness of God. And so he says in verse 27, King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what's right. Stop sinning and do what's right. Anytime we bring loving correction to somebody else's life, this should be the general framework. Stop wasting your money. Do what's right. Stop putting your marriage at risk and do what's right. Stop goofing off at work and do what's right. Daniel says, break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. In other words, King, you're going down the wrong path. You're making unwise choices. I'm not judging you and just writing you off. I want you to have success in this world. I want you to be right with God. So please, because I love you, do what's right. I firmly believe there may come a time in each and every single one of our lives where God may call you to have this exact type of conversation. How do we do it, though? Well, thankfully, Paul gives us some great advice. He says this in Galatians 6:1. Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path. He says gently and humbly, not arrogantly and harshly, as so often happens inside a local church. It's listen, friend, because I love you, okay? Because I care for you, not because I think I'm better than you, not because I'm looking down on you, but because I love you. I just want to speak into your life. I want to help get you back on the right path. There is a tremendous spiritual principle here. And that is that the goal of confrontation is restoration, not condemnation. And in my opinion, the reason so many non-Christians and the reason so many burned Christians love to quote the don't judge others verse is because they have been on the receiving end of condemnation. Paul is saying the goal of this is not to come down on somebody like a ton of bricks. It's not to make them feel like trash. That's not love. The goal is to lovingly come alongside someone and go, hey, there's a better way. See, when Paul says that you need to be gentle and humble, he's letting us know that approach matters, that there is a right way and there is a wrong way to confront somebody. So last week, if you were here, I talked about how I made a predetermined resolution. We're talking about that, right? I made a predetermined resolution to always go to church. And when I was at college, even though I might have been out till 4 in the morning, I made a predetermined resolution that I would make the church at 9 a.m. Well, there's a follow-up to that story. And I've told this to you before. I'm going to tell it to you today, and I'm going to tell it again in the future. And the reason I tell this story is because every single time I tell this story, someone afterwards grabs me and goes, I needed to hear that. And so I just firmly believe there is someone here today or watching online that needs to hear this particular story. So I graduated from college, and I moved down to Florida. And I just happened to become friends with one of the owners of one of the biggest nightclubs in South Beach, Mansion Nightclub. If you remember that back, it was like 2004, okay? Every Friday, Saturday night, we would go there. I was 22 years old. We would sit at the owner's table. I felt like a big shot. Oh, okay? But no matter what, no matter how late I was there, I always made it to church. Always. And I was living with this mindset that as long as I'm making it to church, everything's fine. Well, unbeknownst to me, my mom was starting to have some concerns because my nights were getting later and later, and the company I was keeping was getting faster and faster. Now, for the record, right, let the record show, I was not making any unwise decisions, okay? But the path that I was on concerned my mom. And so one day I get a phone call from her. Hey, listen, she says, I'm glad you're having fun. Dad and I are glad that you made some friends down there. We're thrilled that you found a church that you love. But, and I say this with love, she says, your Saturday nights are too frequently spilling into your Sunday mornings. And I'm concerned that you're not giving God your best, you're giving him what's left over. And she was right. And for as long as I live, I will never forget those words. And because she approached that conversation with gentleness and humility, because she did not come down on me like a ton of bricks, rather with love and respect, the Holy Spirit was able to use her and to touch my heart. And from that day on, I made a commitment to skip Saturday nights. This day I won't go out. Ask my friends. I have no friends. Ask my wife, though. Maybe that's why, okay? I'll do a dinner, okay? But I want to be home at a reasonable hour so that I can give God my best on a Sunday morning, not just what's left over. So Paul says to be gentle and humble when we help other people. But then he gives us a warning. He says, but watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. In other words, when you go to speak to somebody about an issue, when you go to have that tough conversation, when you go to confront somebody over some unwise choice they've made, confront them with caution. Why? Because when you confront somebody over an issue, you could become vulnerable to pride. If you're not careful, you might view yourself as the more spiritual person, right? The one who's got it all together. But hey, thank God I'm in your life. What would you do without me? The other reason we want to confront with caution is because perhaps our motivation for confrontation can be wrong. And I know this might be difficult to believe, but sometimes even as Christians, our motivation for these conversations can be a little self-serving. Because sometimes our emotions or our sin nature can cloud our judgment. And so before you go to that person, you got to check your heart, as they say. You got to get on your knees and you got to seek out God's wisdom to find out, is this a God thing or is this a you thing? Right? Is this a God thing or is this a me thing? Because I can tell you this, in my career in ministry, I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've seen, witnessed, heard, been a part of, where I hear somebody go, I feel led to say. And you can just tell by the tone of their voice, I feel led to say. This has nothing to do with God. This is all about them. And I want to go, really? You feel led to say, who's leading you? Are you sure this has nothing to do with you? You're positive. You have no ulterior motives in this conversation. You sure you're not just angry? You sure it's because you just didn't get your way? Before we go to somebody else, we got to ask, have I totally removed myself out of this equation? Because God could have given you this burden for this issue in that person's life, Or it could be that burden just reflects a weakness in your own heart. Now, the interesting thing about my mom's advice to me is that she has no recollection of ever having that conversation. None. Which leads me to believe that when God puts a burden on your heart, you're merely the vessel. It's not about you. It's about God working through you to touch that person on your path. So Daniel speaks in Nebuchadnezzar's life. King Nebuchadnezzar, please, he says, accept my advice. Stop sinning. Do what's right. Does Nebuchadnezzar listen? No. Does he repent? Change his ways? No. He just keeps on rebelling. And sure enough, the dream comes true. He is driven into the wilderness and he goes insane. But here's why this is so important for us. God may call you to speak into somebody else's life. And you may answer that call with gentleness and humility. And sometimes they will listen and they will change their ways. And they go, you know what? You're right. I'm messing up. Thank you. Thank you for honestly having the courage to speak to me. Thank you. And other times, they might just put up a wall. Like Nebuchadnezzar, they might just refuse to listen. Like Nebuchadnezzar, their heart may be hardened to the truth that everybody else can see but them. And maybe they're just not ready to listen. But here's what I want you to know. You are not responsible for their response. Their response is not your responsibility. You are simply responsible for being obedient to what God has called you to do. And you leave the results up to him. That's exactly what Daniel did. And after those 7 years, by the grace of God, Nebuchadnezzar had a revelation. Take a look. In his own words, he says this. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eye toward heaven. My sanity was restored, and then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. He repented. His life was restored. God was glorified. Here's what we need to realize, okay? And this is where so many Christians get it wrong. The goal of correction is not to tear somebody down, but to build them up. Paul, Jesus, and their various writings, they're calling us to be for one another, not against one another. They're calling us to live together and to love one another and to speak truth to one another at the right time, for the right reasons, so we can experience the right results. So what's practical? What do you do with a message like this? If it's your first time here at Downtown Harbor Church, every single week we put this word on the screen because we want to make sure you can leave on a Sunday and know exactly what to do with what you heard. So today's goal was not to challenge you to kind of get out there and go confront somebody. Shouldn't be looking for confrontation. That's not the goal. The goal is to prepare us for when God taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, it's time. It's time. So knowing there will be a time, we want to get ready now. So I would encourage you now to check your vision, as I'm going to say. Check your vision. What do I mean by that? When Jesus said in Matthew 7:1, do not judge or you too will be judged, he didn't stop there. He continued to drill down. He says, and why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you got a log in your own? And by the way, if you didn't know this is a joke right here. Grand exaggerations were the height of humor at this time. The crowd would have been dying. All right? He says, how can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. You know what he's describing here? He's describing somebody who confronted without caution and fell victim to pride. This is when you go to somebody with an air of superiority. This is when you go to them because you're right and has nothing to do with making them right with God. Now, if Jesus stopped here, the practical would be, mind your business. Mind your own business. He didn't stop there. In fact, he gives us a command. Look at what he said. First, this is your command. First, get rid of the log in your own eye. Then, number 2, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Listen. I know that we are hesitant to have tough conversations. I don't like having them. But as a Christian, we sometimes have a responsibility to have those kind of conversations. And life is not about leaving people alone and minding their own business. And according to Jesus, Life is about getting to a place through prayer, self-reflection, where you can appropriately, at the right time, in the right way, with the right motivations and the right reasons, confront someone about the path that they're on. And that's not judgment. That's love. Let me pray for you.